Tonight we go back in history from the period of our last lecture to a time when the Founding Fathers were debating how the United States would be organized and governed. It's of local interest that, you know how I'm always throwing in these local things, even though they're not exactly completely related to what we're doing. It's of local interest that Major Pierce Butler of Hampton Point Plantation played a part in the early debates as a South Carolina representative to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It's also notable that Butler was serving as the first senator from South Carolina when Congress passed the Lighthouse Act on August 7, 1789, placing lighthouse construction and management under federal jurisdiction. That act was the 9th piece of official legislation and the first Public Works Act passed by the U.S. Congress, demonstrating the importance of maritime commerce to the new nation. Both James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, key players in the formation of the government, supported the creation of the federal system of lighthouses, as opposed to allowing the states to continue maintaining their own beacons. Madison was the first member of Congress to raise the issue of federal support for lighthouses on April 21, 1789, and Hamilton, who took office as the first Treasury Secretary in September 1789, became known as the first lighthouse superintendent. Our speaker, David Stewart, who describes himself as a founding father's junkie, carefully studied the multifaceted relationship between these two brilliant men while writing his most recent book. A graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, David became a writer of history from after practicing law for many years. As a trial and appellate lawyer, he defended accused criminals, challenged government actions as unconstitutional, and argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. His law practice drew him into writing his first book, The Summer of 1787, The Men Who Invented the Constitution, which became a Washington Post bestseller. While briefing a case to the Supreme Court, he had been fascinated by the 500 pages of James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention. After writing a second book about President Andrew Johnson's impeachment trial, David wrote his third book about a former visitor to our island. Entitled American Emperor, it described Aaron Burr's controversial activities after his duel with Alexander Hamilton, when he developed plans to attack Mexico. It's interesting to note that exactly 211 years ago, Burr was staying on St. Simon's Island at Hampton Point Plantation seeking refuge after the duel. During that stay, Burr lived through one of the worst hurricanes of the century. And I have to tell you that last week when we were all watching Erica, I was a little bit worried about history repeating itself this week. In developing this year's series about prominent figures in lighthouse history, I wanted to include something about the early years of our nation, even though our first lighthouse was not established until 1810. I guess I was hoping there would be other founding father junkies in the audience. I was drawn to David's new book, Madison's Gift, which examines James Madison's partnerships with 5 contemporaries, including Alexander Hamilton. Tonight, David will describe how these two men, both of whom understood the importance of lighthouses, worked together and in opposition to each other to form a successful new nation. David?
With any luck, you can hear me now. Excellent. Thank you very much, Mimi, for that introduction, and thank you all for turning out. This is a very impressive audience, and I'm proud to be here. I got committed to this Madison project because I became transfixed by 2 facts about James Madison. The first was that I really concluded he was just so central to the nation's founding, indeed, perhaps more central than anyone other than George Washington. The conversation starts with Washington, but I think Madison's lists of achievements are really staggering. He was the moving force behind calling the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the writing of the Constitution at the convention. He and Hamilton wrote the Federalist Papers that argued so persuasively for ratification of the Constitution. He led the battle to ratify in each of the states. He was the leading member of the first Congress sponsoring lighthouse legislation, and also writing the legislation that established the new government. He wrote the Bill of Rights. That's pretty cool. He secured their adoption. He was co-founder with Thomas Jefferson of the first American political party, which was then called the Republican Party. It's still with us. It's called the Democratic Party now, and it's changed a little. But it was a pretty impressive creation. In the pivotal presidential election of 1800, he was the co-architect of the transfer of power from the Federalists, who had held office under Washington and John Adams, to Thomas Jefferson as leader of the new Republicans. It's often said that the true test of a democracy is the peaceful transfer of power between contending parties, and in 1800 we met that test. Madison was Secretary of State during the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the nation. He was our first wartime president, leading us through the War of 1812, not a glorious episode, but one that we survived and came out okay in, taking on the greatest military power on the globe at that time. And it occurred to me that he was probably our only two-term president whose second term was better than his first term. Think about it. The presidents in your lifetime, the second term it's a nightmare often. So that was the first fact. The second fact, though, was despite all of these amazing achievements, Madison's often ignored. I found myself telling my editor that he's sort of the Zelig of the American founding. He's always there, but nobody notices him. And that's an interesting question. Why doesn't anybody notice him? And there's a flip answer. He was short. He's probably about 5'4", 5'5". He was skinny, didn't weigh much more than 100 pounds. He had a soft voice. People had trouble hearing him. In rooms filled with noisy people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, or with large, charismatic men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Madison was easy to miss. I actually think there's something to that. I think that experience of him as a person is something that echoes through history. But there's another answer which I think is more interesting. Madison was different from most great leaders. Most of them have strong streaks of narcissism. They need to be at the front of the parade, preferably on a white horse, with a band playing. They crave recognition, they crave acclaim. I won't point to any current candidates for office, but you can perhaps extrapolate from my remarks. But Madison had none of those qualities. He disliked public events, never became comfortable at them. There's a wonderful story at his first inaugural ball, that was the nation's first inaugural ball, actually. He was elected our fourth president in March of 1809. He's sworn in, gives his inaugural address badly, because he's a terrible speaker, and then goes to the ball, and some friend comes up to him and says, "Isn't this a wonderful occasion? Congratulations." And Madison says, "Well, I'd rather be home in bed," which was really true. He was a man who cared about results, not applause, about making the American experiment in self-government a success, about realizing the promise of our revolution. A long-term colleague offered a striking description of him. Under all circumstances, he was ever mindful of what was due from him to others, and cautious not to wound the feelings of anyone. That really stuck with me, particularly the phrase, ever mindful of what was due from him to others. I think we have a lot of leaders who are very mindful of what's due to them from us, less mindful of what's due from them to others. When you examine Madison's remarkable contributions, it also emerges that he rarely operated alone. And that's what I started to focus on. His greatest achievements were the fruit of great partnerships. And one way I found to think about it was as though we had taken a modern personality test, one of those Briggs-Cheney or whatever they call those. I got the name wrong. And that he could, you decide whether you're an extrovert or an introvert or an ISBJ or an XRZW. And he concluded that he was, in fact, short and skinny. He had a soft voice, and he had zero personal magnetism. All true. Now, a candid self-assessment also would note some powerful positives. He was smarter than virtually anyone he met. He had a rare capacity for hard work, extraordinary political foresight and judgment, and a gift for making connections with people and working with them. So why not make common cause with people who had some of the talents he didn't have and complement them with his own? Now, we don't know that he ever made such a self-assessment, but the idea gave me a lens through which to examine his extraordinary career as a man who understood the power of partnership. Immodestly, I'm sure you can tell, I think that there may be some important lessons from Madison's career style that could be applied in any era, including our own. Now, I talked about 5 partnerships. The first was with Alexander Hamilton, and that's what you're going to get most of today. Hamilton was a big contrast to Madison. He was a flashy, charismatic personality. And they were peers. They were close to the same age. And they both had a deep commitment to making the United States, this experiment in self-government, a success. There's, of course, George Washington. And Madison was as close to Washington as anybody ever was as a political ally. But Madison never kidded himself that he was a peer of George Washington's. Nobody was. Washington was 19 years older. Washington was, in the famous phrase, the indispensable man. After all, he ran for president twice, and there was never a vote against him. Madison realized that if he ever wanted to get something done in the early republic, being next to Washington was the place to be. So he made himself the indispensable man to the indispensable man. A very different partnership from the one he had with Hamilton. The third partnership is the one maybe we think of most with Madison, which is Thomas Jefferson. Again, a very different partnership. They really were soulmates. They were intellectual equals. They were interested in everything. They talked about everything. They wrote about everything: science, philosophy, politics. They were tinkerers. They were always sending each other designs for hinges and mold boards for their plows. And they came from the same world. They grew up 30 miles apart from each other. They were both heirs to good fortunes, and they were both major slave owners. And they had a lifelong partnership. James Monroe, somewhat younger than Madison, more of a pal than an intellectual peer. I was sort of disappointed when I was working on the book to discover the number of people who said, well, Monroe's a fine fellow, but he's a little dim. Which was not what I'd sort of hoped to read about him. They were a very effective political partnership, principally during the War of 1812, which was a very difficult time for Madison. He was not a naturally military or martial character. Monroe was. And Monroe was his Secretary of State and his Secretary of War. For 2 periods of time, he was simultaneously Secretary of State and Secretary of War. I think he's the only man in our history who's done that. And then finally, his wife Dolly of 42 years. She was, a wonderful historical figure, terribly important to his political success. She had all the charisma, all the personal warmth, all the personal magnetism that James Madison didn't have. It's somewhat reminiscent of my marriage at that level. For this talk, I want to go a little deeper, and at the encouragement of the management here, I'm focusing on Hamilton, but I think that's a good one to pick on because you've all heard forever about Washington and Jefferson. I've already indicated to you Monroe's sort of a complicated story, and you should read about Dolly yourself by getting the book. So let's start with Hamilton. He was unique among the framers. It was an era where it mattered to have money. I guess it's never stopped mattering, but it really mattered then. It was very hard to get away, and Hamilton didn't have a thing as a child. He was born to unmarried parents in the West Indies. He was orphaned in his early teens, went to work in a trading company, scratched and clawed his way over to away from the West Indies to New Jersey, got himself an education, went to Columbia College, and he was a bright, shining light. His brilliance shone from the earliest days. He was dynamic, electric. His gifts were just all over. He would walk into a room and take it over. And if he'd had enough to drink, he'd jump up on the table and lead everybody in song. He just had something special. He was successful at everything he tried. He was a soldier, he was a lawyer, he was a financier, he was a statesman. And he had great passion, great talents. He also had great flaws. He had a very unfortunate extramarital affair that he ended up writing a 60-page essay about that he published at his own expense. It's a very odd thing to do. And he had an even worse weakness, which was he often would say what he thinks, what he thought. I'll give you an example of that as we go along. But this extraordinary mingling of great talents with really tragic flaws at some level are probably why he's the subject of a hit Broadway show right now. I hope some of you have even seen this. It's a show called Hamilton, of course. It's astonishing. I did get up to see it in the spring. It is a hip-hop version of the founding of the nation. That's pretty implausible, I will grant you, but it was fabulous. And what's impressive to me is the man who wrote it, he's a young man, gets the history right, as well as having an incredible gift for writing songs and putting on a great show, but he cares a great deal about the history. And I'm very impressed by it and encourage you all to learn more about it. And we're just going to even give you a flavor of that here tonight with any luck.
I'm past patiently waiting, I'm passionately smashing every expectation, every action's an act of creation. I'm laughing in the face of casualties of sorrow. For the first time I'm thinking past tomorrow. And I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. And it will just like my country, I'm young, scrappy and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot. We gon' rise up, time to take a shot. We gon' rise up, time to take a shot. We gon' rise up, it's time to take a shot. Rise up, it's time to take a shot. Rise up, it's time to take a shot. Rise up, take a shot. It's time to take a shot. Take a shot. And I am not throwing away my shot.
So it's better than having me sing. I'm just tickled that there's something getting out into popular culture that's telling this story, which is such an important story and one I've spent a fair amount of time on myself. Now, Madison is in many ways very different. Just compare this image to the one we showed of Hamilton. This is Madison at roughly the same age. He was certainly no soldier. He was small, I've said. He was often ill. He had a lifetime of intestinal ailments that I won't tell you anything more about, but also symptoms, recurring symptoms that were a form of epilepsy. And he was bookish. He really was an intellectual fellow. I mentioned he enjoyed fortunate birth. He was the eldest son of the largest landowner in Orange County, Virginia, the owner of 100 slaves. Indeed, Madison never really had to work for a living. And one of the striking things I realized partway into the research was he had never had a home of his own until he was 43 years old. He would, when he went off to different congresses and different public appointments, he'd just take a room in a boarding house, and then he'd go back to his parents' house in Montpelier. Indeed, he shared Montpelier with his mom until he was 78. She lived to 97, which was pretty impressive. Now, in the early 1780s, Hamilton and Madison meet for the first time. Hamilton's been a soldier in the army. Madison has been in politics. He spent about 30 days as a soldier with the Virginia militia, and everybody agreed that he should do something else. And they were both members of Congress. Congress was a very disreputable organization then, even worse than now. And they immediately, I think, recognized two facts about each other. One was unusual intelligence. They were clearly the smartest people in the room. But also, they shared a despair that the American government, as it existed at that time, could not survive its crippling problems. This is before the Constitution. We were operating under something called the Articles of Confederation. And you have to recall that we go into the Revolution, and we fight the Revolution for the first 6 years without a national government. Congress was a diplomatic body to which the states sent representatives. There was no national government until the Articles were ratified. And that didn't happen until 1781. When they're finally ratified, you still have an incredibly weak structure. Americans had seen a strong central government. That was the British Empire, and they didn't care for it. So they wanted to ensure local control. And they went overboard on it. Congress had almost no powers. It couldn't even adopt taxes unless all 13 states agreed. And of course, that never happened. It couldn't take major actions unless 9 states agreed, which almost never happened. So people stopped coming to Congress. And it became a real crisis in a number of ways. We had no national currency. Now that sounds like maybe not that huge a deal, but go out and try to buy an ice cream cone. The currency, we had 7 state currencies, and then we had foreign currencies. Madison was actually paid in Portuguese moidores. Prussian johannes. There were Portuguese moidores in circulation in Spanish dólares, but he was paid in Prussian johannes. The most frequent currency, though, was the British pound sterling. Now that's pretty humiliating. We beat the British and we're still using their money. And you read the accounts of travelers going across the country, and everywhere they stopped, it was a currency negotiation. You'd present Pennsylvania pound sterling. No, we don't accept those here. Well, how about Portuguese moidores? Well, we'll give you a 40% discount on those. The economy dried up, trade dried up. It was too hard to do business. And the states fought bitterly with each other. Massachusetts got so angry with Connecticut, they imposed a tariff on imports from Connecticut that was higher than the tariff on imports from Britain. They were at war with Britain. That was a pattern. States with good ports would impose heavy taxes on goods going to states that didn't have good ports. They fought over land. There was a big argument over a part of northeastern Pennsylvania that was settled by people from Connecticut. They showed up there and decided they still wanted to be part of Connecticut, so they elected a member of the Connecticut legislature, and they kept paying Connecticut taxes. Pennsylvania was not amused, and they sent in troops. Happily, there wasn't an actual confrontation, and we had the lawyers save the day, as we always do. There actually was an arbitration, and they came up with a good solution, which was that Pennsylvania is in fact part of Pennsylvania. But as compensation, Connecticut was given a strip of land just below Lake Erie that was called the Western Reserve. It was part of Connecticut until 1801, and if you know Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, that's the history of the name. It comes out of that dispute. New York and New Hampshire claimed that they controlled Vermont. Vermont was pretty sure that it belonged to itself. 7 states claimed lands in the West, beyond the Appalachian Mountains. None of those states had been formed yet. Virginia claimed all of it. And it was an angry time when not much could get done. And for Hamilton and Madison, this was a subject of tremendous despair. They thought that this bright dawn of the American Revolution was going to dissolve. And we would end up like Europe with some little states. You might have a New England country and a Middle States country and a Southern country. They would form alliances with European countries. And the promise of America would never be realized. To try to counter that tendency, a conference was called for Annapolis. It was held here at the Annapolis State House, which still stands in Maryland. And it was summoned to deal with all the commercial issues. I've mentioned a few of them. But almost nobody showed up. They only had 12 delegates who turned up from 5 states out of 13 states. Madison and Hamilton were 2 of those 12 delegates, and they did not despair. But they got incredibly impatient, sitting around Annapolis day after day waiting for someone to show up, and they finally wrote that they decided to take a daring step. They essentially played double or nothing. This was to be a commercial conference. They said, the heck with this. We need a conference about the whole government, because none of it works. So they issued a call for a second convention, which was what became the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia the following year in 1787. That call was drafted by Hamilton, and consistently with his pattern, he wrote a fiery document. Madison pulled him aside and calmed him down, and they made it a little softer, which was how they worked well together. And the call went out. Most importantly, Madison persuaded Washington to support it, which he did. And ultimately, some 9 months later, the convention was convened, did meet. This is the room they met in the State House in Philadelphia, what we now call Constitution Hall. Both Madison and Hamilton were delegates, but they had very different experiences there. Madison, consistent with the way I described his understanding that as long as he stood next to Washington, things were going to be okay for him, glued himself to the side of General Washington. Washington came. He was elected president of the convention. And Madison simply took the seat next to him. I hope you can see there's a presiding chair, and then there's a table next to him. Madison just walked up and sat down there and started taking notes. Madison had been terribly frustrated. He spent some 6 months preparing for the convention. He'd been terribly frustrated. at the lack of records of earlier republics. There had only been a few in Greece, Switzerland, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, maybe in Italy you might count one or two. But there was no record as to why they set themselves up the way they did. And he's committed himself to create a record of why Americans were making the decisions they were going to make in structuring their republic. And those notes have proved an incredible resource for later generations. It explains what they were thinking about. It often explains why they did something, what they were trying to do, and what they didn't do that perhaps they should have. Madison was an extraordinarily active member of the convention. He was among the 5 delegates who spoke most frequently. But ironically, the final Constitution was not much to his liking. Now, I'll give you a small flavor for the event. This is an artist's view of the final day when they signed the Constitution. And of course, you've got Washington, gigantic in the middle of it, and then next to him is the little guy, that's Madison, and we know it's Madison because he's holding a quill pen. And it was a meeting attended by really the best political horseflesh in the country. And they were powerful people, and Madison wasn't able to get his way on a lot of things. His initial proposal had been for a constitution where the people would elect a lower house of the legislature, the lower house would elect an upper house of the legislature, and then both houses together would elect the president. Well, we don't do anything like that. He also insisted, and he proposed this 5 separate times at the convention, he insisted that Congress had to have a power to veto state laws. He thought state legislatures were instruments of the devil. They were doing terrible things. They were irresponsible, not to be trusted. And Congress had to have a veto power. He lost that vote 5 times. And of course, we don't have that power. Indeed, he also proposed that there should be a joint judicial and executive commission to review all congressional laws. He was very nervous about anybody doing anything. He thought people ought to be watched, not really to be trusted, not with power. He didn't get that either. He complained in letters to Jefferson afterwards. Jefferson was our minister to France at the time. He was not at the convention. He complained that the Senate was not to be elected by popular vote. It was elected by state legislatures for the first century or more under the Constitution. He was unhappy that the president was not to be elected by popular vote. We have this electoral college system. And he was in despair over the lack of a congressional veto over state laws. Indeed, a scholar went through the debates of the Constitution at the convention and determined that on 70 key votes, Madison lost 42 times. Indeed, late in his life, when someone wrote to Madison that he was the father of the Constitution, Madison said, no. The Constitution was the product of many heads and many hands. And that's true. And it's actually sort of impressive that he had the modesty to say so. Well, and I wish we would take him at his word. He is still often called the father of the Constitution. So where's Alexander Hamilton in this painting? I can't tell you. I think he's probably in there somewhere. He's not obvious, and that's appropriate. If Madison left Philadelphia with mixed feelings about the summer's work, Hamilton felt actual revulsion towards it. Indeed, he despised the entire convention process, as it turned out. The New York delegation was a catastrophe. There's no other way to describe it. The legislature set them up as 3 people. Madison was one, and they had 2 other people who disagreed with Hamilton on everything. They believed in states' rights. They really didn't want a new constitution. Hamilton believed in a powerful central government. And the rules that were set down said that the New York delegation could only cast a vote if 2 members were present. So whenever Hamilton was present, if one of the other guys was there, they would cancel out his vote. So on key votes, New York would either have no vote, or the other two guys would be there and would outvote him. So after about 4 weeks of this, the other two guys are terribly unhappy with the way the convention is going. They decide to go home. It's Robert Yates and John Lansing. So they skedaddle, and Hamilton's left there, a man without a delegation. He doesn't actually represent a delegation. He's been totally neutralized. He's terribly frustrated, and so he gives in to one of his fatal flaws, which is he says what he thinks. He delivers a 5-hour speech. I will not speak that long. And he calls for a president who will serve for life. Sounds a lot like a king. He calls for senators to serve for life. Sounds a lot like dukes and earls. And he also calls essentially for the abolition of state governments, because they're such a carbuncle on the body politic, in his opinion. Now, the other delegates all agreed that he spoke brilliantly, but nobody agreed with him. And he's a bright fellow. He figured out that nobody did. And after a few days, he just went back to New York and practiced law for a while. He came back twice during the rest of the convention. He spent a week there in August trying to see what was going on, and then he comes back for the close of the convention. And on the final day, he speaks from the heart, and he says that no man's views were more antithetical to the Constitution than his. Certainly true. But he commits that he will support it because it's the best we can do. And he signs it, which is a funny thing because, of course, he's not actually part of a delegation. And Washington, who keeps a diary every day, much of his life, writes down for that day, we signed the Constitution today, it was signed by 10 states and Colonel Hamilton. Now, even though both men really disliked the Constitution, they resolved to make the best of it. They were terribly afraid that the nation would crumble if it weren't ratified. And that's where we get to the Federalist essays. Now, the Federalist was Hamilton's idea. He thought of it as a series of propaganda articles. That's how you influence public opinion in those days, was through the newspaper. No broadcast media, no internet. Newspapers were really the only available tool. And that would be distributed around the country and would bring people around. He recruited 3 different New Yorkers to help him to write some of these. He thought there would be 25 essays. 2 of them turned in work that he thought was completely unacceptable, so he just threw that out. John Jay actually wrote a couple of good ones, but then he got sick. So Hamilton's 4th choice was Madison. He was a Virginian, for heaven's sake. But it turned out to be an inspired partnership. Although Hamilton had proposed 25 essays, they ended up, once they got started, producing 80. Once they started writing, they pretty much couldn't stop. These were things they'd been thinking about for 10 years. How do you establish a new nation? And it's important to remember that America in this era was really a laboratory of constitution writing. We wrote 13 state constitutions and 2 federal constitutions in a 10-year period. Our leaders really did think about these problems. And Madison and Hamilton had thought more deeply and more intelligently about them, really, than anybody else. Some argue that the essays, which did run in many newspapers, didn't have so much of a direct effect on the actual ratification votes in the state conventions. But the Federalist itself still stands as the best writing about American government that's ever been done. it's important also to realize that it was produced in a mad rush. They sometimes produce 4 in a week. This is an example of one running in a newspaper in 1788, and I like to put it up there so you'll appreciate that newspaper readers in 1788 had to be pretty tough. It was not easy to read. No photographs, no headlines to speak of. But a single newspaper might be read by 5 or 6 different people and then read out loud at the general store. They were passed around from hand to hand, so it was a very effective means of communicating. At one point after they started up, they sort of took turns. Madison wrote 22 of the essays in a row. Then he had to go back to Virginia to run for office to get into the Virginia State Ratifying Convention, so Hamilton took it over and wrote the final 25 on his own. So it was a combination of a remarkable coordination with extended solo pieces. Elements of it are wonderful, and I should note it also, even at the time, was published as a book. And of course, ever since, it's still a big seller. Hamilton wrote the essays about the executive branch and the military. After all, he had been the soldier. He also wrote about the courts. He brilliantly made the case for the power of judicial review, the ability of the courts to strike down laws as unconstitutional. And he famously called the courts the least dangerous branch of government, an assertion that is alternately embraced and reviled, depending on what people think about the most recent Supreme Court decision. Madison, although he didn't write as many of the essays, I think ultimately outshone Hamilton in these. He was not a brilliant stylist. His prose has been likened to insurance contracts. But he was remarkably smart. And his explanation of the theory of checks and balances, which is what is embodied in the Constitution, is the finest we've ever had. Pardon me. And continues to be read in every college course. I also want to read to you from Federalist number 51, a passage where Madison actually did write wonderfully, and where he captured the fundamental puzzle of government and self-government. Just a couple of sentences. If men were angels, he wrote, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed. And in the next place, oblige it to control itself. That's the problem. And we're still working on that one. I don't think there's an answer to it, but I don't think anybody's ever described it better. Now, publishing wonderful essays didn't get the Constitution ratified. Ratification required tough political work. Hamilton and Madison were in New York for the winter of 1788, and in that time they coordinated the pro-ratification forces. Now, 9 states needed to ratify. This is the image here shows a pillar for each of the states. The pillar image was one that was very powerful at the time. You can see on the left, Delaware is the first one to ratify, and a cross. But Madison and Hamilton had a particular burden because they were respectively from Virginia and New York, which were states where the Constitution was in trouble, where there was deep opposition, and states that had to be in the Union for the nation to survive. Opponents insisted on many changes. They wanted to remove the congressional power to impose taxes, or the power to create an army. They thought a standing army was a terrible idea. It's an invitation to adventures abroad and oppression at home. They demanded a Bill of Rights. The people at the convention had forgotten to include a Bill of Rights. That made people very anxious. A lot of people called for a second convention, basically saying, well, this was a good try, let's start over. That particular proposal made Madison crazy. He thought it was a miracle that they'd been able to agree on a constitution and that it was not going to happen a second time. It also became clear that Rhode Island and North Carolina were not going to ratify, so New York and Virginia began to loom very large. Virginia was the largest state, most important state in the Union, but there was something even more important, which was George Washington lived there. If there was going to be a new government, everybody wanted George Washington to be president. And if Virginia wasn't in the Union, he couldn't be president. New York was similarly important because of its great port and its great commercial significance. So Hamilton and Madison were going to have to bring their home states in. And they set off to do that. Madison was a delegate to the Virginia Convention, which met in early June in Richmond. The delegates were about evenly split between Federalist and what was called Anti-Federalist. Madison endured some terrible health problems during this month. Again, his intestinal troubles, his epilepsy troubles. And he also faced a ferocious opponent. It was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry hated the Constitution. Indeed, after it was ratified, he swore that he would never take an oath to support it, and he never did. And his confrontation with Madison, which lasted for 2 weeks, was a classic confrontation between a slugger and a boxer. Henry, the one legend we have of him is his wonderful oratory, and he was a powerful, brilliant speaker. And he attacked the Constitution from the first day. And he attacked from the first word. He attacked "we the people," the first words of the Constitution. He said, what are they saying, "we the people"? It should be "we the states." Who are the people? He warned that the Constitution, rather than securing rights, would take them away forever. He spoke darkly of the immensity of the dangers presented by the Constitution. Madison is this little skinny guy. He's got a pretty good reputation now, though. And he gets up day after day, and in his quiet voice, and people have to come down, get close to him to hear him. He pokes holes in Henry's arguments, and he shows the inconsistencies, and he makes the case. And finally, Madison's forces win narrowly, 89-79. And they think they're the 9th state. They're going to put it across the goal line, and then they discover New Hampshire had just ratified. So they were the 10th state. But it was a tremendous victory, a personal one, for Madison. And the news is rushed up by express rider to Poughkeepsie, New York, where the New York Convention is convened. There, Hamilton is facing an equally formidable opponent, New York's Governor George Clinton. He's not a guy we remember very much. He was politically powerful. He was not a speaker, not an intellect, but an effective guy, and he also, equally with Patrick Henry, hated the Constitution. And the numbers in the New York Convention were terrible. The opponents outnumbered the pro-Constitution forces 2-1. So the Federalists, led by Hamilton, went into a stall. And they argued about everything. They went through every comma, every semicolon. hoping that the word would come from Virginia, that Virginia had ratified, and then the people in New York would realize the ship is leaving the harbor. You've got to get on board. So the word comes, and nothing happens. Nothing changes. The Anti-Federalists don't budge. So the Federalists switch their tactics. Suddenly they won't say a word. They stop talking, leave the Anti-Federalists to stew in their own juices. After another week, it takes a long time, the opponents realize that reality begins to set in. There is going to be a new government. What's left of Congress begins to schedule elections. It's going to happen. So they try to find some halfway house, and they have a proposal for New York to conditionally approve the Constitution. They'll ratify it, but they'll take it back if a few things don't happen. And in a wonderful final moment of the ratification fight, Hamilton takes the floor, and he raises up a letter he's just received from Madison. And he says, I have received this advice from the authority on the Constitution. A conditional ratification will not work. We still will be out of the government. At that point, the opposition does collapse. Hamilton and Madison together have caused it to, and very reluctantly, New York did ratify. Now, under the new Constitution, Mimi talked about it, Madison becomes the leading figure in Congress. Hamilton becomes Secretary of the Treasury and really supplants Madison as Washington's closest aide, and soars to influence. He's still a young man, still in his 30s, but then his political career was effectively over by the time he reached 40. And it ended famously, of course, or notoriously, in the duel with Aaron Burr. I always loved this image. I remember seeing it as a boy reading history books, and you see Hamilton is grabbing his head even though he was hit in the side. It seems the artist was poorly informed, but it's very dramatic. Madison had grown disenchanted with Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. They worked together for about a year, and then they began to separate. Hamilton's financial system troubled Madison. He thought it unwisely concentrated power in the rich. He thought it created instability. Indeed, we had a number of financial panics in the first couple of years under the Hamiltonian system. And that ended up driving Madison into opposition. From being Washington's closest confidant, he ended up becoming the leader of the opposition in Congress. And it underscores a key point about Madison, which is he formed these wonderful partnerships, but he never conceded his own judgment on political matters to his partners. If his views diverged from the partners, so be it. And Madison and Hamilton, on the key argument over the Bank of the United States, this was a creation that Hamilton was strongly for to give us an economic core to the nation's government and the nation. Madison thought that was beyond Congress's power, and it all turned on this key phrase that Congress can adopt laws to promote the general welfare of the nation. And although they fell apart over this key issue on the Bank of the United States, they were able to agree on it as it applied to lighthouses. And that was the derivation of the lighthouse legislation. And Hamilton was in charge of the lighthouses for his 6 years, or 5 years, as Treasury Secretary. And the first lighthouse that they built, fittingly enough, was the Cape Henry Lighthouse, which still stands in Virginia. And just as a flavor that politics has never changes that much, how could Madison oppose a new lighthouse for his own district? A final thought about Madison and Hamilton I'd like to leave you with is that despite their disagreements, and they spent 10 years as political opponents, they always retained mutual trust and respect. In 1796, Madison has led the opposition to Hamilton's policies for 4 years by now. Washington needs to appoint a new minister to France. Hamilton says, appoint Madison. He's the right guy for the job. And in retirement, when Madison's back home at Montpelier, and it's decades after Hamilton dies, Madison wrote about his old partner that Hamilton possessed intellectual powers of the first order, moral qualities of integrity and honor in a captivating degree. Even though Hamilton disliked the Constitution, he cooperated faithfully in maturing and supporting a system which was not his choice. Ironically, that description might be applied to both of them and to their great partnership in the birth of America. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would be happy to respond to a few questions, if you have any. I solve everything? Oh, lights, that's good. Yes?
Moving from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution and the Commerce Clause and the taxation that gave them power, and we seem to have wrapped all or most of our laws around those two things today. How do you think the framers would feel about the power of the federal government today?
You know, that's such a tough question because the world is so different. You know, I've even thought about trying to write a book about the, you know, it's sort of a fiction, you know, imagining the framers coming back today. I figured, I don't know why, but I figured Hamilton would be a hedge fund guy. Franklin would be out in Silicon Valley. And Jefferson, I just always thought of him as a talk show host. I'm not sure why. But they would be stunned, to be more serious. They would be stunned by the size of the federal government. They would be stunned by the size of the nation. They would be stunned by our international commitments. So much is amazing. I use in comparison in the book, when the new government starts in 1789, we have 4 million people, and counting all the soldiers, something under 1,000 federal employees, employees of the national government. Oregon has 4 million people and had 80,000 state employees. So it's not just the federal government, it's all government. And we want government to do things for us that it never would have occurred to the founders that government would do.
I mean, how they wrap those two clauses, how they found a way to get power by wrapping them around those two clauses in Article 1, Section 8.
You know, I'm reluctant to grant them total foresight on this. I think some clever lawyers have been able to use those opportunities. And it's been supported by a national consensus that we wanted government to do these things. And that's why we vote. So I think they would be, first of all, astonished that there still was a government under the Constitution. At the convention, people said if it lasts 50 years, we'll be stunned. And then, after taking it all in, they might feel better about it. But absolutely, this is a very different world. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Your check will come. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.